Hi, I'm Ben Barnett, the CEO of Ziplet. And at Ziplet, we work with tertiary institutions to measure, understand, and enhance the student experience. And Ziplet has teachers and institutions on our platform from all across the world. We work with about 80,000 teachers across 140 countries and around 15,000 institutions. And today, I'm delighted to be joined by Davina McArthur in conversation about student experience and what makes a great student experience at tertiary institutions. A little bit of background about Davina. So Davina is a principal at the Nous Group, which is an international management consultancy, which is based in Australia, but has offices around the world. Davina leads Nous's higher education practice in New South Wales. And importantly, she co-leads Nous's global student experience subsector. So today's conversation, which will touch on student experience, what makes a great student experience, what we can learn about what the best institutions are doing around the world in terms of student experience, Davina is very well positioned to provide insights with respect to that topic. Davina's background is one where she has been a management consultant for the bulk of her career with over 15 years experience. And through that work, Davina has partnered extensively with universities, leading projects with respect to their strategy, transformation, new models of education, and importantly, student experience. Most importantly, and why it's particularly topical for us to be meeting with Davina at the moment is that Nous Group is about to release a global study on delivering student experience, which Davina co-led with colleagues at the Nous Group. This particular study was an extensive one that had leaders from around the world. More than 180 student experience leaders were involved in the study. And today we'll be talking through great examples of student experience, but we'll also be touching on some of the highlights of the study to understand lessons that institutions can take with respect to that study. So, Davina, it's a pleasure to have you in conversation, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Ben. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be talking to you this afternoon.
Excellent. And so, Davina, let's jump straight into the topic. So, the topic for today is really around what makes a great student experience. And I think before we dive into what that looks like, it would be good to get your sense of what do we mean by the term student experience, and what do you think it currently encompasses for tertiary institutions?
So, Ben, I think it's best to define student experience as a broad term. It's one that needs to be considered. We often talk about curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular. So it needs to be everything from teaching and learning, from learning and teaching, I should say, through to student life. And it needs to be all the touch points between an individual and a higher education institute, from pre-enrollment right through to graduation and engaging with the university as an alumni. So a really broad sense of the term is important.
And do you think, particularly post-COVID or even beyond that, the breadth or the term of student experience has changed over time at all?
I think it was a trend that was happening before COVID, but I think it was very much brought to light through COVID, and some of those components about what makes student experience has that sort of sped up through that process. I think there's sort of two ways in my mind that the scope has shifted in terms of what we talk about when we say student experience. I think the first is in regards to who the audience is and when it happens. So what we might have traditionally seen as an activity about on-campus activities, very much orientation week, as we call in Australia, or Freshers Week, and described differently in different countries, but that sort of idea of let's really kind of set up how the student feels like they might belong in an on-campus way with the university was kind of the traditional discussion of student experience. Or it might have even been seen in quite a segmented way as talking about the teaching and learning component of student experience, so very much the experience in the classroom. And it's shifted to be thinking about all students in all aspects. And then I think secondly, it's broadened. So I think traditionally we wouldn't have naturally thought about we wouldn't have thought about necessarily housing and accommodation, or we might not have thought about mental health when we thought about student experience. And it's not to say that universities haven't been providing that for a long time, but I think there's been this shift in expectations that the university is thinking about that and recognising that a whole range of things about how a student, what their expectations are of what the university will provide, what their family expects, particularly for those who are post-school leavers, of what the university provides has become a much broader term in what it encompasses when we say student experience.
And when you're working with institutions and talking with leaders around what a good student experience looks like, what do you think is at the core in terms of why a concern for student experience matters? What's really at stake in terms of focusing on student experience?
I think it's come to that change in terms of university students. Expectations have changed, and I mean, you touched on the study, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about this, but we heard from one student leader, we're seeing that shift from elite to mass education, and even from sort of a step beyond that to mass personalisation. And with that comes significant expectations from students about what they have when they have student experience. I think then that to meet those expectations in quite an increasingly competitive market, many universities have increasingly looked to understand how can they deliver not just a good experience, but an outstanding one. And that competitive edge that comes from creating and curating a leading experience for all students. I think that to me has become a really important point about why it matters. I think as well, it's, if we take the Australian example, that opportunity to differentiate and have a really leading student experience becomes important in a sector which has not had a great deal of differentiation at times in the sector. So that becomes really important as well.
And presumably students are seeing rising standards of service delivery in all aspects of the economy.
Exactly. Yes,
so yeah. Start to ask themselves, why is this not necessarily being reflected in their tertiary education experience?
Exactly, and it's that real sense of how is it, and we've heard it described in this way when we've talked with those in the sector of why is it harder to get a bank loan, or why is it harder to sign up? Why is it harder to enrol than it is to get a bank loan or to sign up to a Service New South Wales component? Traditionally we always sort of kind of government the laggards in their engagement with institutions, and we're hearing that in many cases university experience is pretty different to their experience elsewhere in life.
And I guess in that respect, as word of mouth, whether that's online or offline, increases and is more readily available, institutions are thinking about the enrolment end, so attractions in terms of students being attracted and, as you said, differentiating their experience. And presumably there's something also at the other end in terms of a negative student experience, meaning a student might be more likely to drop out, and that might having a national implication as well.
And I think we see a segmentation in the market in Australia between universities that have increasingly focused on that retention side versus those of focusing more on recruitment. So it's kind of that we can see that playing out in where universities are putting their effort as well. So that becomes interesting.
And start to formulate, I guess, sort of thinking about a unique or ideal student experience and how an institution might go about that. Do you have a sense, either from the study or through other work that you've done at NOUS, around what are the factors that are most important in terms of making up that positive student experience? Obviously, a lot of touch points along the way, but are there some particular factors or areas or touch points that you think are more important for students? So
in preparing for the interview, Ben, I was thinking actually at the broader set of metrics and things, and even if we take QUILT, which, as you know, but for your global audience, is the student experience survey that's run in Australia, the sort of key drivers behind that in terms of the positive experience, the universities that really stand out for being rated by students and significant I think they have hundreds of thousands, 240,000 completed the survey last year. The greatest areas that drive those experiences are in learner engagement. And that includes things like belonging, online and face-to-face engagement with the university from a learning perspective, and then interaction between and among their peers and other students. So that becomes critical. There was also Salesforce releases a global report every year called Connected, which is all about education and the education sector and student experience within that. And there, in the most recent one, they said the foundation for success for student experience is belonging, and having that, if university students feel like they belong, that has a whole range of connection points beyond that link in. So that's a really interesting one. But I think we know about learner engagement, and as I said before, we have this curricular, co-curricular, extracurricular, and so that's the foundational piece, and the cornerstone piece is in that learning engagement in the curricula. And we know that in many ways, when students think about their engagement in study, they're first and foremost thinking about themselves and their alignment to disciplines. So that becomes critical. If the learning and engagement piece, they can if the university can get that right, then that sort of flows on from there. But if we think, another component that I think is worth highlighting is the element of personalisation and flexibility. So we know that there's been a significant interest in that, but also in recognising the diversity of students. So that comes into the fact the curricular, the co-curricular and the extracurricular is for the universities that can really understand the student, their needs, not just their demographic, but also their psychographic elements in terms of what makes up them, why they've chosen to study, what their motivations are. The more that they can tailor their response to that creates a really outstanding student experience. So it's one that's all about them, personalised.
And again, the context outside of tertiary education is one where personalisation
exactly
is something they experience on a regular basis. Are there particular, if you think through their concerns with respect to personalisation or flexible delivery, are there particular examples or flashpoints that you continually hear in terms of your work that are opportunities to deliver a better student experience in relation to those particular attributes?
I think, I mean, in the study that we did and in the universities or the projects that we work with in this space, we've certainly seen the ways to really think about understanding those students and creating that personalisation in response to understanding them is twofold. One is through data, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, Ben. So I won't go into it in too much detail here, but it's that ability to, in a privacy and ethically informed way, collect and use that data about what the student wants to then respond to that. And then I think the second is in partnership. So again, it's a little bit more in the study, but you know, the 180 student experience leaders that we heard from in our survey, we heard significantly this point around partnering and co-design as an effective approach to driving for good student experience. But in fact, when we delved into that in more detail, only 1 in 20 were using partnering. So really going into co-design and co-delivery of the student experience. So that's then making a whole lot of assumptions about what students want to be their student experience without actually engaging students. So the really good examples that I've come across in some of the projects we've worked on is setting up front what is the student experience strategy, using that co-design process and data-informed process to develop the strategy for that, and then using that almost as the anchor or kind of key point to sort of keep coming back and testing, are we delivering against this? So what's the monitoring and reporting? What are the ways that we're testing back against what we've set out to do and what we've defined our student experience as, and then what that might look like?
And let's focus on that first piece then, which is defining a unique student experience. And I think unique, as you touched on, is important because there are competitive pressures and students are increasingly spoiled for choice, and that choice is only growing as technology enables more and more institutions to be a legitimate choice for students when considering where they'd like to study. What do you think are the key steps that institutions need to go through, should go through, in terms of defining that unique student experience that both works for their students but also has potentially market value as well for them?
So I do think it's that process of co-design in terms of really working with students in a range of forums to define what that student experience looks like, and then drawing on a range of initiatives that sit below that to then create that experience. So be that technology, be partnering with third-party providers where it's providing supports. If we take the mental health, for example, is it something like Sonder where you're using a third party, or is it something like Studiosity where you're using a third party really strategically to help them create that student experience as you've defined it?
And how and where do you think it's the best way to codify this and roll it into the sort of strategic and I guess even operational aspirations of an institution? What are the critical steps there?
So I think one of the things, it's a little bit around, do you build the plane while flying it? So it's, in many cases, the range of parts of the institution that work in this space have been working for a very long time. So how do you take that stock to say, well, we've got real clarity around the kind of students we would like to enroll, and then how do we flow that through and think about where we bring together the range of different groups or operational areas. And when I say operational, both professional and academic. So recognising that if we talk about curricular, co-curricular, extracurricular, the academics are critical to this in terms of creating a high quality student experience. So how do we bring together the different groups that might be thinking about student success and then create that approach?
And is that best codified in a strategic plan for the institution, a separate student experience strategy, or other artifacts within the institution?
I think it's best codified in a student experience strategy, and I've seen the institutions that are doing that. I think the only sort of caveat I recognise, and one of the things we heard a lot about in the study is, the shift in the funding that's happened in universities, and so being quite aware and a reality of that around not necessarily having the sort of a broad budget for student experience, particularly post-COVID. So in that sense, Ben, I think there's a little bit around an opportunity for a bit of a startup mentality. So it's a little bit of, let's target this initiative so we know that for our students, or a particular cohort of our students, be that the international cohort of students or even a subset of that, or HDR students in the postgraduate space, what are some of the things that are going to really lift their student experience? Let's make sure that we might have set the strategy, but if we don't have the funds to create a full-scale transformation, can we trial a few initiatives and change a few things and then see if that works, rather than trying to sort of create this full-scale transformation as defined by a strategy that then we don't have the resources and the skills to do. And I've just touched on one more thing, which I think is important around that, is then also things like the staff skills. So it's not just resources from a budget perspective, but also the staff and a timing perspective. So how do we work with staff to identify those leading pockets and then replicate what might be done in one area in another, what that might look like?
So in many ways, it seems it's advantageous for tertiary institutions to try and act quickly, work out where some particular touch points might be, gather some data around that, understand it, and then try and, in a reasonably agile way, bring together some initiatives that will quickly have impact.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
And I guess there's also, students are only there for a couple of years often, so you need to understand that quickly,
Yes.
and ultimately be able to deliver some things of high value.
And there's some really interesting examples, and I'm happy to share with you the report when it comes out in the next couple of weeks, but even some of the ones that come immediately to mind that different institutions are doing, like the University of Glasgow, for example, has feedback kiosks. So they're they'll trial initiatives, and then the kiosk, the little smiley face, frown face is right there for people to have their vote on. We've changed the catering options here on campus in this way, or can you rate us on that? Or we've changed this in response to something. What's your feedback on that? So getting that really kind of immediate and lifetime feedback, I think, can be important.
And I'm assuming that links into the co-design strategy where you source some of these ideas with students, and then you try and quickly stand them up, almost in the spirit of an MVP, minimum viable product, or something, quickly.
Yes.
To be able to gather some data again back from your students and iterate through that.
Exactly.
And then that eventually evolves into probably something that becomes standard practice and almost a hallmark of the experience at that particular institution.
Exactly, but I think it comes a little bit to the matching behaviour, and that's where the data becomes critical to what people say they want. So it's a small example, but we always talk about everyone on saying, oh well, I'd come to campus more if there was some great healthy food options or really good coffee, and so you trial a pop-up food store with salads, and yet everyone still buys hot chips because they're really thrilled to be on campus and it's got great hot chips, because the pub is where everyone wants to go to have a drink and hot chips. So it's that sense of, well, how do we marry up the behaviour of what people are doing and use that example of let's make sure that what people say they want in fact flows through to how they behave and how they respond to the initiatives that the university is trying.
So in that sense, some of the qualitative early data is potentially around sourcing some ideas and really learning and understanding.
Yes, yeah.
Follow-up data collection is seeing how you've actually gone with that.
Exactly, yes.
Whether it's hit the mark and what improvements might make. The other part that you mentioned there, Davina, was as with most things within organisations, there's always limited budget, and while student experience is absolutely core to the offering of tertiary institutions, there's also contestation across the institution for resources. You touched on some of the things that you might be able to do that don't necessarily require resources, which is around staff capability, or even mindset. To me, seems an important one, where just having front of mind that student experience is something we ought to think about, and something that's important. Do you have a sense of who should be thinking about student experience, and maybe anything in terms of your work where institutions have done a great job of even just getting their staff to be thinking about student experience as something that's important for their organisation?
So I think one of the things we've seen in a few of the different universities we've worked with, where they're doing it really well, they are seeing that absolute collaboration between both the professional and the administrative, the academic staff. So we have both the professional and the academic working really closely together, and often that's working even better where there's some centralisation of, even if we have the academic teams embedded back in almost like a business partner model, but almost bringing together where you can some of those key aspects of the professional staff alongside the academic staff as well. And then a good example I can think of in one of the Australian universities we've worked with, the key teams that are thinking about student success all the way from that enrolment through to the graduation piece are then reporting up to someone that has in their title student success or student experience and has that clear role and responsibility for that. So it's thinking about two elements here. One is the leadership and the importance of holding that accountability at a leadership level, but then sitting below that is a really close collaboration between the academic and then the professional staff.
And it would seem that creating a function around student experience means that there'll be reporting with respect to that, which means that staff will be energised in terms of identifying examples of where they have been delivering on student experience, or be looking for those opportunities to fill that function.
Yeah, exactly.
So quite often institutions go through a process of realising that student experience is important, both it's their core business, and it also helps them to differentiate themselves in the market. They might develop a strategy around it. Presumably, they will build a function around it and some resourcing around it, even if it's contested. And then often they will try to make gains, but sometimes the gains might not happen as fast as they would like. What do you think are some of the, other than resources, what are some of the blockers that you think that prevent institutions from fully realising their student experience?
I think some of the main barriers that we've seen in organisations, one is around technology. So having that really, and I know we'll talk a little bit more about technology and innovation, but having really strong systems and ways of using technology that support that student experience. I think staff skills and capability is important to recognise that can be a barrier where it's not been a sort of organisational cultural way of working around thinking about student experience. At times it can be organisational structure if the areas that are most focused around student experience don't have that visibility or are not working kind of in concert and in collaboration with other parts. And then I know I touched on it, but just to because it comes up time and time again is around funding. So calling that out as well.
Are there any good examples of celebrating success or gains that you can think of that institutions have been able to do, or any rituals or artifacts that they've used to be able to internally create momentum around the gains, the improvement, share on some of the positive feedback that they receive from students? Any good examples there that come to mind?
There's some interesting models emerging, particularly in the US, where they're using data analytics, probably in the most mature way around really kind of collecting and then thinking about the range of metrics to create dashboards and then play that back. So that to me, there's a few American examples that probably come to mind of using that to then say, well, this is how we're going to change the student experience, and we're really clear on what are causing the pain points and how we respond to that.
Great. Going a little bit deeper in terms of technology and innovation, what do you think are some good examples or approaches in that respect that can be used to support a positive student experience?
I think there's so many different ways, and the kind of different tools that are emerging are really fantastic. So there's that maturing use of supporting systems, so CRM systems, and thinking about the ways that you track the student throughout their student journey, but then also thinking about increasing use of things like chatbots and digital tools that enable that access to the university and student administration services in particular. We're also seeing much more customized experience and the use of robotic process automation to enable that kind of pre-fill, make a lot of the administrative processes, be it accessing a work integrated learning certificate through to the enrolment process, automated. It makes it much easier for the student to engage with the university. And as you say, they're increasingly seeing that outside of education space, so they're expecting it from universities as well. But then also the range of apps or ed tech companies that are working in the space that then universities are partnering with. So thinking about everything from, I gave the example before, but Studiosity, where it's all about enhancing that learning engagement. Ziplet, as we know from a feedback perspective, organisations like Quitch, which is all about gamifying how students engage. So I think there's some really interesting solutions that are emerging from a technology and innovation perspective that universities are working with to support the range of things they're doing at that more system level around things like the CRM.
And I guess to go back to your earlier point, having a little bit more DNA within the organisation that relates to a startup mentality around embracing some of these tools, may or may not know whether they are right for that institution, but how do you create a quick and dirty pilot or quick and dirty way of assessing them, learning from that and deciding whether that's the right tool.
Exactly.
Like that's part of it as well. If we think about, so I guess the final piece is really around, we've identified our student experience, we're starting to implement it and live it on the ground, and then institutions are asking themselves, what metrics should we be tracking to whether we're making progress with our student experience? What's been your sense in that regard?
So I think the metrics point is this really actually needs to come right up front. So the universities that are doing this well are off the back of that strategy saying, right, what are the 8 to 10 outcomes that we're measuring against? Which of these are lead indicators? Which of these are laggards? What can we collect in real time? What are we going to line up with or correlate against things like external benchmarks around student experience surveys, national student experience surveys, and they're creating that really clear framework almost immediately after or in the process of developing their student experience to say, this is the experience we want and this is how we measure, and get a sense of how we're going to report on whether they're providing a student experience, a positive student experience. And then in addition to that, Ben, I think then we're starting to see a few of those, few of the more mature universities then taking a step further to think about dashboards and how do we get that immediate. And if we go back to the point around personalisation, how do we use our technology in a really sophisticated way that we're collecting feedback in from multiple angles, but at any point in time I can open up our system and check, oh, Davina did really well in that subject. That links to the fact that we gave her some help in terms of a living assistance where she was having some issues, and we realised that this is a whole person who has a particular set of needs. We've identified them, and then we're thinking about her engagement with us to understand what's working and what's not.
And ultimately, where does that responsibility fall? Does it fall with the academic staff that are supporting that student? Are you seeing institutions increasingly bringing other staff members into providing that support with respect to engagement?
It seems to be, even though the academics are probably at the forefront and that's kind of front line in terms of the actual engagement with the students, I think we're seeing it as a bit more of an institution-wide activity, because you're often needing, for example, the teams that are in the digital areas or the CIO portfolio. We're seeing people that sit within the professional areas in terms of things like enrolment and student administration. So it's ultimately where it's being done well goes back to that model of that student success team or someone that kind of brings all of those pieces together at the back end. So it's not as though the student has this kind of job to join up the dots, rather the university sees that as their role.
And in terms of how institutions are gathering data on these metrics, what systems or processes are they using?
So I gave example of the feedback kiosks before. I think we're seeing a range of different measures. Some of those that are using things like the chatbots or the apps that have that immediate response. They're collecting things like what are the common questions being asked and how do we sort of correlate that to understand what some of the pain points are. Are we using, so it's that real spectrum from what's the immediate lifetime feedback through to then some of those forums like the co-design sessions, hearing from students, and then other things like surveys, and then through to some of the more formal measures as well.
Right, so basically a whole array of tools that are gathering data in different ways, different levels of detail, and points in the student journey as well.
Yes, yeah, and I think, as I said, it's still a little bit. I think the ideas are maturing. I don't have sort of many immediate examples of universities that kind of have that, as I said, that kind of clear dashboard perspective, but there's certainly universities still working on it.
Okay, great. And Davina, as we mentioned at the top, there's an extensive study that you've been heavily involved in terms of understanding student experience, and you've worked with 180 student experience leaders globally. Tell us about that study and I guess the process, and really what were the key findings that have come out of it?
So the scope of the study that we undertook was to think about the system that sits behind, in the broader sense of the word system. What are universities doing to deliver the student experience? We were aware of the amount of research and work that's gone into what is a good student experience, and we were conscious of the value for our clients in terms of the universities that we work with, and actually thinking what's the system that sits behind that? What does delivering an outstanding student experience look like? And we know in many cases universities will think of a good experience, but how do what shifts the dial from good to great? So we set out to do that. We did that in a number of different ways. We started with some preliminary discussions with leaders, particularly those who we were working with, executives and directors responsible for student experience and success, to focus the survey and the study. We then ran a survey of, as you said, more than 180 student experience leaders, and that was at universities in Australia, Canada, and the UK, to understand their perspectives on what delivering an outstanding student experience looks like. We then had workshops and roundtables with staff and students to test and validate those findings, and some in-depth interviews with leaders to further explore them. So we also then brought into all of that NALSA's experience working with universities in those 3 countries and research into leading global practice. So a fairly expansive study in that regard. And in terms of the key findings, we've touched on a lot of them, but just to play them back here, the first was that universities want to better understand today's students. So we know that contemporary students are quite a diverse cohort, and the ability to collect and analyse data and partner with students is vital if universities are to better understand their students' individuals and collective needs. That was theme number 1, or observation number 1. The second was around the student experience being considered holistically. So moving from that sense of just an academic experience or just a social life experience, that really students don't see that as separate when they think about student experience. The student experience leaders who were involved in our study said to us time and time again that we need to think about this as one package. And in doing that, therefore, we need to be really thinking about academic and professional in terms of that integration. So the academic needs to be integrated with administrative, mental health and wellbeing, and other student services. We then explored a range of practical approaches that are succeeding. So the title of the study is From Promise to Pragmatism. And in that, we wanted to really focus on what are the practical things that universities are doing to transform the student experience. And in the study, we heard from leaders about 6 focus areas that transform their experience. And that was from in a range of areas, from technology and innovation, process automation. We heard about particular universities focusing in on targeted initiatives, staff capability and culture, as well as talking to universities about, I've just lost the last one, let me find it. And then the final theme is in monitoring. So monitoring student experience is tough, but it is vital. So it's been a really important thing in terms of during and after completion. It's important to improve outcomes as ensuring that leadership is accountable.
Right. And so in many ways, the study touches on some very specific examples that institutions have looked at.
Yes.
And that other institutions can presumably, and other leaders can learn from. Was in wrapping up on that study, Davina, was there anything that surprised you about the research?
That's a good question, Ben. No, not surprising. I think it was exciting to see the range of different things that were coming out, and the different approaches that universities were drawing on to really try and shift the dial in this area.
Okay. And our final question, Davina, which we ask of those that we speak to in these similar contexts, is what will a great student experience look like in 5 years' time?
So I think then the great student experience in 5 years' time will be one where, using data and co-design or partnering approaches, universities will have a really clear picture of the student and their personalised, and what a personalised experience looks like for them. So it'll draw on things like technology, third-party providers, and looking for feedback to continuously improve on that experience and build off that.
Excellent. Davina, thank you for your time today. We will make once the survey is released, we'll make it available to those in our network so that they can learn from that. And yeah, thank you for your time.
Not a problem. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Davina. It was great. Let me just stop the recording.
That's okay.
I don't know how to do it. You're probably dashing off to something in 1 minute.